these programs, it's very important to have our coolest and oldest heads in the business.
Oldest?
And, I mean old only in the point of experience, Gus.
What you just saw there was Gus Grissom being introduced during NASA's Apollo 1 crew announcement back in March 1966. And even in that short moment, you can feel how much weight NASA was putting on experience, steadiness, and trust. Gus Grissom is one of those early NASA names that still feels like pure grit. He was part of the Mercury 7, became the second American in space, and later commanded Gemini 3. The kind of resume that should have carried him straight into the Apollo spotlight. But when people bring him up today, the conversation often turns to a single awful night. January 27, 1967, when a ground test for what was first called Apollo 204 ended in the Apollo 1 fire, killing Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The tragedy sits in pop culture like a warning label on the whole space race, because it happened before the first crewed Apollo flight even launched. In the middle of all the engineering talk, one detail stays painfully human: what Grissom reportedly told his wife, Betty, before it happened. Today, we're focusing on what Gus Grissom said to his wife before he died in the Apollo 1 fire. The warning that stayed in the house.
Colonel Frank Borman, the command pilot for our first Saturn V manned flight, put it this way: I hope that the people in the United States are mature enough that when we do lose our first crews, they accept this as part of the business. Pat White, Betty Grissom, and Martha Chaffee had all watched friends' husbands die in testing. They acclimated themselves to it just as a combat GI's family does, and then forgot about it.
Apollo 1 is usually described with technical language, but the story begins in a quieter place inside a family routine where the stakes never fully leave the room. Astronaut spouses had to live with the risk, but they also had to live with the day-to-day reality of it, the small silences and the forced calm. According to accounts from the Grissom family, Gus told Betty something that sounds more like a grim forecast than a dramatic farewell. The line most often repeated is that if a serious accident ever happened in the program, it would probably involve him. It's not mystical. It sounds like a test pilot looking at a chain of weak links. There's another remembered exchange that gets repeated because it shows how blunt the conversation could be. Betty has been quoted saying she told him he wasn't going to fly until things were fine, and his answer was essentially that he wasn't. Whether you take that as literal scheduling talk or emotional shorthand, the mood is the same. This is why this topic sticks. You can study diagrams all day, but it's hard to shake the idea of a husband walking out the door with a sentence like that hanging in the air. Liberty Bell 7 and why he hated being blamed. Gus Grissom's career already had a shadow on it years before Apollo. In 1961, he flew Mercury Redstone 4 in the Liberty Bell 7 capsule, a short suborbital mission that still carried enormous pressure. The flight itself succeeded, but the recovery became chaos. After splashdown in rough water, the hatch blew open and the capsule began taking on water. Grissom got out, but critics quickly claimed he must have panicked and triggered the hatch. That accusation followed him for years, and it hit hard because it painted him as careless in a job built on procedure. Later evidence pointed to a hatch issue that could occur without astronaut error, and Grissom insisted he never touched the activation plunger. The capsule sank and was not recovered for decades, which kept the controversy alive and made the story feel unresolved for a long time. Grissom was not interested in looking cheerful for the cameras if the hardware was not right. When he complained, it came from someone who had already been burned by a narrative he felt was unfair. The test that felt like a bad omen.
The screen went blank, and he said there was no communication from the astronauts. They died silently and apparently swiftly. Their bodies have been left in the spacecraft, according to the latest information from the Cape, pending an investigation into the disaster.
What you just heard there comes from a CBS News special recorded only hours after the Apollo 1 tragedy, and you can hear the uncertainty in real time. In those first reports, even the experts were careful to stress that the cause was still unclear, that early talk of an electrical problem was only speculation in the moment as everyone tried to understand what had just happened. Apollo 1 was supposed to be the first crewed mission of the Apollo program, a step toward the moon with Grissom as command pilot, White as senior pilot, and Chaffee as pilot. On January 27, 1967, they entered the command module for a plugs-out test, basically a mock countdown and systems run with the craft on the pad. The test dragged on for hours, with problems that were not just annoying, but alarming. The crew reported issues with communications, and accounts describe Grissom getting irritated enough to say, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" That line still gets quoted because it captures the frustration and the stakes. Other stories from the period describe Grissom calling the module a bucket full of screws. And then there's the famous lemon tale, where he was said to have tied a lemon to the simulator hatch as a sour joke about the craft's readiness. Whether every detail is perfectly documented or not, the overall picture matches his reputation. He was openly worried. Then the fire started. At about 6:31 p.m. Eastern Time, the crew's voices turned urgent. One of the most chilling phrases attributed to Grissom in those moments is, "I've got a fire in the cockpit." Another frantic line heard from the capsule was, "Get us out." Within minutes, all 3 men were dead. Why the fire became a trap.
The full rehearsal before you do the launch was essentially what this test was. They also call it plugs out, where they unplug the spacecraft from external power supplies. So it runs on its own power supply. To do that, you have to close the hatch and you pressurize it with oxygen. Now, the way we had done Mercury and Gemini was the same way we did that particular vehicle. We pressurized it with a little bit more oxygen pressure than sea level. Well, sea level pressure is roughly 15 pounds per square inch, so you put a smidgen more, like 15.2 pounds per square inch. Anything in that kind of pure oxygen will burn. You can burn steel wool in there.
The horror of Apollo 1 is not just that a fire started, but how quickly the environment turned it into a killer. The cabin atmosphere for the test was pure oxygen under pressure. Oxygen does not explode on its own, but it makes fire spread faster and hotter, and materials that might smolder in normal air can flare violently. Investigations pointed to an electrical fault, often described as exposed or damaged wiring beneath Grissom's seat. A spark in the wrong place was all it took once the cabin became a furnace. The inside of the module also contained flammable materials and Velcro-like fasteners that helped flame travel. Even if the crew had been able to stay calm, the hatch design made escape almost impossible. The hatch opened inward and could be difficult even in ideal conditions. In the fire, pressure inside the cabin rose, pushing the hatch tighter into place. Ed White reportedly tried to begin the hatch opening procedure, but the physics worked against him. Outside the capsule, technicians rushed to help, fighting smoke and heat. Several suffered smoke inhalation while trying to get the hatches off. By the time the hatch was opened, the crew had already succumbed, with later summaries describing asphyxiation from toxic gases and severe burns contributing to the outcome. Investigations, rumors, and the family's suspicion.
I never thought about the fact that an accident like this could happen on the ground. It was the kind of thing that I think went through our minds, that if something's going to happen, it's going to happen on the way to the moon, or it's going to happen in space, or it's going to happen when you lift off, or when when the parachutes don't open and when you come home. We were sort of prepared for those kind of things, but not prepared for fire on a pad.
After the tragedy, the official explanations focused on a deadly combination: vulnerable wiring, pure oxygen, flammable materials, and flawed design decisions. The result was not just blame, but a push to redesign. Later Apollo spacecraft used a different hatch approach and safer cabin atmosphere choices for many phases. But Apollo 1 also became a breeding ground for suspicion, partly because it was hard to accept that something so basic could kill 3 of the most trained men in the program. One figure often mentioned in those conversations is Safety Inspector Thomas Ronald Barron, who criticized conditions and tried to compile reports on what he saw as serious shortcomings. His later death in a train collision, along with the disappearance of material tied to his work, has fueled rumors for decades. The most intense doubts come from the Grissom family itself. Years later, when remains of the command module were shown to relatives, Gus's son Scott reportedly noticed a fabricated plate behind an instrument panel area and believed it suggested tampering. Scott and Betty both expressed a belief that Gus was murdered or sabotaged, even if the exact motive felt unclear. This is where the story splits into two lanes. In the documented lane, Apollo 1 was a catastrophic accident born from preventable engineering and management failures. In the other lane, the family's grief and anger kept alive the possibility that something more deliberate happened. Either way, it circles back to the same chilling fact. Gus had told Betty that if a serious accident happened, it would probably involve him, and then it did. Now it's time to hear from you. When you hear what Gus reportedly told Betty before Apollo 1, does it sound like a man predicting his fate or one seeing problems that the program was not ready to admit? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.